I think another 10 feet lower and the gear would have been ripped off the plane. Here's a full video. You've heard me talk about it a bunch of times, but it's really important that people don't get the habit of trying to land at the very start of the runway unless it's absolutely necessary. Because while it worked out okay in the previous video, it can look a lot like this if they come up short of the runway. I'm going to slow this down just to show you how close they were to hitting the side of this hill. This is 10 feet at best before the start of the runway. And everybody knows who's going to win in that battle of plane versus dirt. And that's why I always advise pilots never to train or plan to land on the numbers. Landing on the numbers means you're trying to put your plane down right here at the start of the runway, which is where it gets the name landing on the numbers. These are the runway numbers. Airline pilots are actually trained to land here. These big bars are 1,000 feet down the runway. And we do that because everything in the airline world gives massive safety margins. And that means if you're aiming to land 1,000 feet down the runway and you mess up and you land a little bit short, then you're going to land 500 feet down the runway. But if you're landing at the numbers and you mess up, in this case, you're landing into the side of a hill or a mountain. And that's never a good strategy or plan. You want to leave yourself a safety margin, and that's why we do that. Now, typically, you're going to see pilots land long like this, where they're going to float a little bit down the runway, and that's because they're trying to make a smooth landing. When you're trying to make a smooth landing, sometimes what you'll end up doing is keeping a little bit of power in, and that slows the descent rate onto the runway, and you're trying to make the landing smooth because that's honestly how pilots are judged. You can do 99% of all the things right and safely get someone to their destination. If that landing is rough, people are like, this guy doesn't know how to fly. What is he doing up there? So we sometimes will do that, land a little bit long. However, these pilots were trying to land right at the start of the runway. So why would they try to do that? Well, the person who sent me this clip said it was happening in Brazil at the São Carlos International Airport. Gosh, I hope I'm saying that correctly. And this isn't an airport that I fly to because it's relatively small, but according to the internet, this runway length is only 5,643 feet long, which is plenty of distance for a commercial jet to safely land, but definitely on the shorter side. When you're landing on a shorter runway like that, one of the major concerns is going off the end of the runway, floating, trying to make your landing soft, and going off the end. So what you will do is talk about like, hey, we want to land this firm at the start of the runway, not at the threshold, but at the start of the touchdown zone, 1,000 feet down the runway. That's what you're aiming for, is firm, stop before the end of the runway, not how smooth can I make this landing. So there's a time and a place to make your landing super smooth and maybe float a little bit, but generally speaking, firm, right where you're supposed to be, that's what you should be aiming for. But here's the other thing that really concerns me. Now, I don't have the charts for this airport, but just looking at it, you can see that there's a section here at the start of both ends of the runway. This area can be used by the planes to turn around in, but they are not authorized to land in this section right here. But when you look at this video, I'm almost certain the pilots are landing in that area. Now, I don't think that they were planning to try to land on the part of the runway they weren't supposed to be on, but that's why I'm talking about airline pilots have that safety margin to prevent any situation like going off the end of the runway. Looked like the weather was clear, wasn't wet, or at least from what I could see. So they're going to get the best braking action and the best stopping distance that they're going to get. So there's no reason to take that unnecessary risk of trying to land too early at the start of the runway. To give you some perspective, typically what you're going to see is pilots are supposed to cross this section of the runway, which we call the threshold. We want to cross that usually around 40 to 50 feet, and that will have us landing right on this 1,000-foot marker. Now, I never flew at LATAM, and I don't know what this airline's procedures are for this situation, but even on a short runway, the airlines and the manufacturers kind of come together and they work out all the different scenarios so that way the pilots, while we're up there flying, don't have to work anything out. I remember I did a radio interview and we were flying into this random airport and And the guy asked me, oh, were you nervous or scared as you were flying into a place that you've never been to before? No, because all that stuff has all been checked out by engineers and a bunch of other people, so that way they know, hey, that plane can safely land at that airport starting at the touchdown zone and at this weight. All that stuff's been calculated ahead of time. So airlines will have planned for the plane to stop here, and then when they tell the pilots their stopping distance, they actually give another 15% buffer on top of that. So the risk of coming over the threshold, landing in that zone that you're not supposed to land in, and I think that the reason that that area is designed to not be landed on is to prevent this exact same situation. Because if you land a little bit short on, let's say, a small plane and you hit a little bit of grass and maybe some lights, it's not a big deal. But if your plane were to land short, if they were to be 10 feet lower, they could have ripped some of that gear off. You rip that gear off, now this plane can't stop, or it's skidding, or it's uncontrolled. All kinds of bad things happen. So my guess is when they designed that runway, they made that threshold, that displaced threshold, a little bit deeper like that, in order to prevent pilots from trying to land at that part of the runway, missing it, and then having the gear rip off. To give you an example of what pilots would normally see in this situation, I'm just going to use a normal runway. Let's say this runway has 10,000 feet available to land on. When pilots get their numbers calculated back and given to them, the computer's already going to know that this portion of the runway isn't being used. So it's planning for the pilots to land in this area right here from 1,000 to 1,500 feet down the runway. And it's going to tell them they're going to use 8,000 feet of this 10,000 foot long runway. But keep in mind, there is a 15% buffer in there, different for different airlines, but let's say a 15% buffer of safety margin in there. Plus, it usually isn't calculating the thrust reversers, which those are used to actually help the brakes more than actually your stopping distance, but different planes it works differently. So those two things are usually not even calculated in helping the stopping of the aircraft. So you have that safety margin for the buffer, and then you have the slowdown from the thrust reverser. So usually that stuff isn't even factored in there. And they do that because they know at the end of the day, you're going to have some pilots who are going to be better than others. And so they want to make it available for people like me who like to float sometimes down the runway. And my point in saying that is, for the math here, these pilots should have been able to successfully land much further and safer down the runway and successfully stop their plane. Instead, they took it within a few feet of hitting the side of this hill, which to me is really an unnecessary risk. In case you didn't realize it, we had our own little narrator in there letting us know that there was a bird strike. Bird strike! Bird strike! Now I can't tell you for sure because it's kind of the angle of where it happened, but it looks like it was in the number 4 engine, which is the engine furthest to the right. The thing I want you to notice is, look how little impact this bird strike into the engine, probably killing the engine, but it has very little impact into this plane. And that's because commercial airliners are designed to be able to fly at 50% of their power. Now granted, this is a 747 and we have 4 engines, so taking a bird strike into one engine and killing that engine, not really a huge deal. There's 2 different levels of emergencies that we have when we're out flying. One, you have a pan, which is, hey, I need some priority handling, something's going wrong, I'm not happy with this situation. And then you have a mayday, which is, hey, controller, put your snacks down, my life's in danger here. We need to be really focused on what's going on for me. On a 747, having a bird strike like this is actually neither, because you're at 75% power. So in this case, the pilots may have just continued their flight. Now, I don't mean that to sound like, hey, you're gonna go and fly the total flight that you were gonna go, because obviously if you're at max capacity for weight and fuel and you have your landing distance, you're gonna end up burning more flying with 3 engines than 4 and all these other things. But you might be going halfway of your distance. So if we're looking at this flight going from LA to Incheon, you can notice this arc here goes pretty close to Alaska. So what may end up happening is you continue climbing out, and obviously you're not going to go to the highest that your plane can go because you have 3 engines instead of 4, so you're running at 75% power, but you're going to climb up and then you're going to end up calling your dispatcher. When you call your dispatcher, they're going to bring maintenance in. So your dispatcher is like your person on the ground that's going to coordinate and deal with all the stuff. They're going to get everything set up for you. So you call them and they're in one of these rooms like this, and they can get a hold of the maintenance people and emergency personnel and all of this stuff. They're essentially your boots on the ground. And so when you call with a problem like this, like, hey, we lost an engine, they're going to start coordinating and getting everything ready for you so that way you can have the safest plan of action. So they may end up, in that case, continuing their flight, let's say going to Alaska. And so if you're continuing that flight going to Alaska, you'll get there, and once you get there, then maintenance personnel will have another engine for you. I'm just making up a scenario. That might not be the case. They might say, hey, we don't have an engine in Alaska, but we do have one in LA where you just left from. Just go ahead and go back to LA, and you probably go to the hotel and they'll put a brand new engine on there and another crew will take it out in a few hours. That may be the scenario, but it's possible that if you take off with that 3 engines now and you're climbing out with 3 engines, you're just going to go halfway along your route and then land there in Anchorage, and then another crew will take that plane and they'll hook up another engine on there. You'd be surprised how fast they can throw a new engine on a plane. It's kind of alarming. So just realize that if you're looking out your window and you watch a bird fly directly into your engine, which I've had as a pilot, I've watched a bird actually fly right across the front of us as we were getting ready to land and then turn and go straight into the engine, and then it made a loud noise. So I've had that happen, but we were landing, so not a big deal. But just realize that if it happens, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to go back to your airport of destination. If you're on a 2-engine plane, you're going to land at the nearest suitable airport, most likely, because now you're at 50% power. And if you lose that other engine, now you got to do a Sully maneuver, and that's not really something you want to do.
We're going to end up in the Hudson.
Too low, terrain.
I'm sorry, say again, Cactus?
Too low.
But if you were on a 747 and you were to hit a flock of birds and you lost 2 engines, it would be uncomfortable for everybody, but it wouldn't be a big deal. You're going to land, you're not going to keep going with 2 engines, but with 3 you might. And that's one of the great things about flying the 747. You lose 1 engine, not really a big deal. Not an emergency of any kind. You're just going to call, make a phone call, figure out where you're going to go, and maybe go back, maybe you're not. You don't ever know. That was actually really close, but technically those pilots that were in the plane that was landing, they could have technically landed unless air traffic control had told them they had to do a go-around. So right here you can see the plane is actually rotated off the ground. They could have landed, but from this angle it looks like the plane that was landing was actually too high to safely land. And from that angle it looked like they were actually really high when I zoomed in on it, but I don't know if it's because they were focused and distracted on the plane that was taking off, because if you're coming into land and you can see this other plane is there on the runway and they're just doing their takeoff, you might be thinking, this is not going to work out, and so I'm going to do a go-around, and so now you're distracted with that instead of focused on landing the plane. And keep in mind, as you know, the pilots can always make a determination that they're going to do a go-around regardless of whether air traffic control has given them the clearance to land or not. You can always just say, hey, this doesn't look good, I don't feel good about this, I'm going to do a go-around. And then you say, hey, you had another plane on the runway there, you didn't coordinate this very well. So they could have done that, but it looks like they were kind of high. You can see that here, but what is cool to see is I'm guessing the controller, when they gave them the go-around or the pilots announced their go-around, they told them to turn right. And the reason why that's great is it gets them out of the flight path of this larger plane. The reason that's really cool is because if that smaller plane were to cross into the wake turbulence of that bigger plane, meaning as those wings are generating lift, the air behind them is really rough. So if you're in that smaller plane and you start to do a go-around, which makes most people who are uncomfortable about flying more uncomfortable because this isn't a normal thing. You're thinking you're about to land, now you're going back up in the air and you're more tense. And then you were to hit that turbulence, probably the second thing that most people hate when they're flying. So you have 2 things that you hate about flying and they're both happening within a few seconds of each other. It's just not comfortable. But the air traffic control isn't doing it for that reason. They're doing it because they don't want these pilots to get into that rough air because it's very uncomfortable and unsafe. So they'll break them off to the right in this scenario, break them off to the right and have them come around and land again. Not a big deal. But I just thought it was cool. As you watch this, you can see this plane is taking off. And this one starts to break right immediately, so they get out of that wake turbulence of that larger aircraft. I look forward to hearing from you. Until then, keep the blue side up.